The Boeing 777 cruised at 37,000 feet through the darkness, its 347 passengers cocooned in the artificial night of drawn window shades and dimmed cabin lights. Flight 2847 from London to Los Angeles had been unremarkable so far. A routine transatlantic crossing that most travelers endured with practiced indifference. In Seat 10C, Captain Sarah Mitchell slept deeply, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion after 3 consecutive days of briefings at NATO headquarters. At 38, she possessed the lean, compact build of someone who lived by military discipline. Even in sleep, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple black sweater, there was something unmistakably precise about her. Her short dark hair, her posture, the way her hands rested carefully in her lap. Sarah had learned to sleep anywhere, a skill honed through years of combat deployments. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, places where rest came in stolen moments between missions. Tonight, she had taken a sleeping aid, something she rarely did. But the NATO conference had drained her. Endless discussions of air superiority tactics, drone integration, future combat scenarios. Her mind needed the forced shutdown. 3 rows ahead, in the cockpit, Captain James Morrison guided the aircraft with the calm confidence of 22 years flying commercial jets. His first officer, Daniel Chen, monitored instruments while they discussed the latest modifications to the 777's flight management system. The conversation was technical, comfortable, the kind of professional shorthand that develops between crew members who trust each other. Neither pilot noticed the subtle vibration that began in the aircraft's tail section. A microscopic fracture in a hydraulic line, invisible during pre-flight inspection, had been slowly widening under the stress of pressurization and temperature changes. It was the kind of failure that occurred perhaps once in 10 million flights, the statistical anomaly that every pilot hoped never to encounter. When the line finally ruptured, it happened with devastating speed. The first indication was a sharp bang that reverberated through the fuselage, followed immediately by a violent shudder. Warning lights erupted across the cockpit panel like a Christmas display gone wrong. Hydraulic pressure, flight controls, multiple systems screaming for attention simultaneously. Morrison's hands moved instantly to the controls, years of training overriding the spike of adrenaline. "We have a hydraulic failure," he announced, his voice tight but controlled. "Multiple systems affected." Chen was already pulling up emergency procedures on his display, fingers flying across the interface. Primary and backup hydraulic systems both showing 0 pressure. Flight control authority is severely degraded. In the cabin, passengers who had been dozing jerked awake as the aircraft bucked and yawed. Overhead, bins rattled ominously. The sudden movement sent unsecured items sliding across tray tables. A child began crying, the sound quickly joined by others as fear rippled through the cabin. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her military training pulling her from medication-induced sleep with remarkable clarity. She recognized immediately that something was seriously wrong. The aircraft's movement was wrong. The angle felt wrong. The muted sounds of alarm from other passengers confirmed her assessment. A flight attendant stumbled past, grabbing seatbacks for support as she headed toward the rear galley. Sarah caught her arm. "What is happening?" The young woman's face was pale but composed. "We are experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened." Sarah released her but remained alert, every sense focused on the aircraft's behavior. She could feel the pilots fighting for control, sense the way the plane responded sluggishly to their inputs. This was not a minor issue. This was catastrophic. In the cockpit, Morrison and Chen worked with intense focus, running through emergency procedures while the aircraft continued its erratic flight path. "We have partial control through throttles and trim," Morrison reported, wrestling with the yoke. "But conventional control surfaces are barely responding. How much fuel?" Chen asked, already knowing the answer would complicate their situation. 4 hours' worth at current consumption. Morrison's jaw tightened. "We cannot make it to Los Angeles." We need an emergency landing now. Chen was already on the radio, declaring an emergency to air traffic control. The nearest suitable airport was Shannon, Ireland, but even that was 45 minutes away under normal circumstances. With their degraded control authority, the approach would be nearly impossible. The head flight attendant, Maria Santos, entered the cockpit, her composed demeanor barely masking her concern. "Captain, the passengers are frightened." "What should I tell them?" Morrison took a breath, organizing his thoughts. "Tell them we have experienced a hydraulic system failure. We are diverting to Shannon for an emergency landing. Keep them calm, keep them seated, and prepare for the possibility of an evacuation on landing." Maria nodded and exited, her mind already planning how to manage 347 frightened passengers with a crew of 12. As she entered the forward galley, she found her team already gathering, concern evident on every face. "We have less than an hour," she told them quietly. "The landing will be rough. We need to brief passengers on emergency procedures, secure the cabin, and prepare for possible evacuation." Her gaze swept across her team. "Stay calm, stay professional. We trained for this." As the attendants dispersed to their assigned sections, Maria activated the public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your head flight attendant. As you may have noticed, we are experiencing some technical difficulties. Captain Morrison has made the decision to divert to Shannon Airport in Ireland for a precautionary landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelt securely fastened. We will be providing additional safety instructions shortly." The announcement did little to calm the rising panic. Passengers pulled out phones, desperately trying to send messages despite the unreliable signal. Parents clutched children. Strangers made eye contact, seeking reassurance in shared fear. Sarah unbuckled and stood, ignoring the attendant's instruction. Her military training overrode civilian protocol. If this aircraft was in serious trouble, sitting passively was not an option. She moved toward the forward galley, her stride purposeful despite the aircraft's continued instability. Maria noticed her approach immediately. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat." Sarah met her gaze steadily. "I'm a military pilot, combat experienced. If there is anything I can do to help, you need to let me speak with the captain." Maria hesitated, evaluating the woman before her. Something in Sarah's bearing, the absolute confidence and clarity, made the decision easy. "Follow me." In the cockpit, Morrison and Chen were deep in consultation with air traffic control and the airline's operations center, discussing approach options for Shannon. The aircraft's behavior remained dangerously unpredictable, responding to control inputs with frustrating inconsistency. Maria knocked once and entered. "Captain, there is a passenger who says she's a military pilot. She believes she might be able to help." Morrison looked up, exhaustion and stress evident in his features. "Send her in." Sarah entered the cockpit, her eyes immediately scanning the instrument panel, assessing the situation with professional efficiency. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force. I fly F-16s, mostly combat missions in the Middle East." Morrison studied her briefly, then made his decision. This was no time for ego or protocol. "Captain Morrison, this is First Officer Chen. We have lost primary and backup hydraulic systems. Control authority is down to maybe 30%. We are trying to make Shannon, but the approach is going to be difficult." Sarah moved closer, studying the hydraulic systems display. "Have you tried differential thrust for directional control?" "We are using it, but the response is sluggish," Chen replied. "The aircraft is not designed for this kind of flying." Sarah nodded, her mind racing through scenarios. "In fighter aircraft, we train for hydraulic failures. The principles are similar, larger scale but similar. You use throttle inputs to control pitch and roll. Coordinate with rudder trim for directional stability. It is like flying a wounded bird. You have to feel it, anticipate its movement." Morrison glanced at Chen, then back to Sarah. "Are you offering to help fly this aircraft? If you think an extra set of hands and experience with degraded flight controls might be useful." "Yes, sir." The two pilots exchanged a look. Pride warred with pragmatism, and pragmatism won. Chen stood, gesturing to his seat. "Welcome aboard, Captain." Sarah slid into the first officer's seat, her hands immediately finding the controls. She felt the aircraft's response, the way it fought against inputs, the delayed reaction to throttle changes. It was like nothing she had flown before, yet the fundamental physics were familiar. "Talk me through your approach plan," she said, her eyes scanning the navigation display. Morrison outlined the situation. "Shannon is 43 minutes out. We will be coming in heavy. No way to dump fuel safely given our control issues. The approach needs to be stable. Any sudden corrections could send us into an uncontrolled situation. Wind is 15 knots, almost directly down the runway, which helps. But we will be landing fast, probably 20 knots above normal approach speed." Sarah absorbed the information, her mind calculating angles and energy management. In the F-16, when we lose hydraulics, we use a concept called energy management flying. You treat the aircraft like a glider with engines. Set up your approach early, maintain a stable descent profile, minimize control inputs. "That is the theory," Chen agreed from his new position behind them. "But this bird does not glide like a fighter jet." "No," Sarah acknowledged, "but the principle holds. We need to set up our approach vector early, establish a descent rate we can maintain with minimal input, and ride it down. Any last-minute maneuvering will be dangerous." Morrison nodded slowly. "All right, let us work it out together." For the next 30 minutes, the three pilots worked in intense concentration. Sarah's combat experience provided a different perspective on flying a crippled aircraft. Where commercial pilots were trained to follow procedures and checklists, fighter pilots learned to improvise, to feel an aircraft's limits and push right up to the edge without crossing over. She introduced techniques Morrison had never considered, using small, coordinated throttle bursts on individual engines to induce roll, calculating descent rates based on energy state rather than traditional approach profiles, anticipating the aircraft's tendency to over-respond to delayed inputs. The cockpit became a strange hybrid of military precision and commercial aviation protocol. Three professionals from different worlds united by a common goal, getting 347 people safely on the ground. In the cabin, the flight attendants had completed their emergency briefing. Passengers now sat in the brace position practice stance, heads down, hands protecting their heads. The cabin had grown quieter, fear giving way to grim determination. People held hands across aisles. Parents whispered reassurances to children. Strangers offered comfort to each other. Maria moved through the cabin one final time, checking seatbelts, securing loose items, offering words of encouragement. Her professional mask remained firmly in place, but inside her heart raced. She had been flying for 15 years and had never faced a situation like this. As she passed row 10, she noticed Sarah's empty seat and allowed herself a small prayer of gratitude. Whatever was happening in that cockpit, having another experienced pilot could only help. Shannon Airport had mobilized its emergency response. Fire trucks lined the runway, their crews standing ready. Ambulances waited nearby. The airport had been cleared of all other traffic. Every resource focused on the incoming crippled aircraft. Air traffic control kept the frequency clear, their voices calm and professional as they guided the stricken 777 toward the airport. "Flight 2847, you are cleared direct to Shannon. Descend and maintain 10,000 feet. Wind 180 at 15, runway 24 is standing by," Morrison acknowledged, while Sarah worked the throttles, using tiny adjustments to maintain their course. The aircraft was responding barely, but responding. It felt like steering a ship through mud, every input delayed, every correction requiring patience and precision. 10 minutes out, they began their descent. This was the critical phase. Too steep, and they might not be able to arrest the descent rate. Too shallow, and they would overshoot the runway. The margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Sarah's hands moved constantly, micro-adjustments to throttle settings, coordinating with Morrison's inputs on the yoke. They had developed a rhythm, a non-verbal communication born from shared purpose and mutual respect. 5 miles out, Morrison called for landing gear. The hydraulic pumps struggled, and for a heart-stopping moment it seemed the gear might not deploy. Then, with a series of heavy clunks felt throughout the aircraft, the landing gear locked into position. 3 green lights confirmed what they desperately needed to see. "Gear down and locked," Chen called out, relief evident in his voice. But the added drag from the landing gear immediately affected the aircraft's behavior. Sarah compensated quickly, advancing throttles to maintain airspeed, while Morrison fought to keep the nose level. 2 miles out, they were lined up with the runway, though their descent path was steeper than ideal. Sarah watched the instruments, calculating in her head. "We are coming in hot," she warned. "Touchdown speed will be high, I know," Morrison replied grimly. "We will need maximum braking, possibly reverse thrust, if we can keep her straight," Sarah added. "Any swerving and we could lose it." 1 mile out, the runway came into full view. It looked impossibly narrow from their perspective, a thin strip of pavement rushing toward them. Around them, emergency vehicles tracked their approach, ready to respond the moment they touched down. In the cabin, passengers braced themselves. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of the engines and the occasional muffled sob. Everyone understood that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. 500 feet. The ground rushed up to meet them. Sarah's hands were steady on the throttles, making constant tiny corrections. Morrison gripped the yoke, feeling for the aircraft's response, trying to sense what it wanted to do versus what he needed it to do. 200 feet. They were committed now, no possibility of going around. This landing would succeed, or it would not. There was no middle ground. 100 feet. Sarah called out altitude. Morrison eased back slightly on the yoke, trying to arrest their descent rate without stalling. 50 feet. The runway threshold passed beneath them. 20 feet. Morrison held the nose up, bleeding off speed. 10 feet. Sarah pulled throttles back to idle. And then, with a jolt that sent a shudder through the entire airframe, the main landing gear contacted the runway. The aircraft bounced slightly, settled back down, and Morrison immediately deployed thrust reversers while standing on the brakes. The aircraft shuddered and shook as friction fought against momentum. They were traveling at nearly 180 miles per hour, far faster than a normal landing. The runway markers flashed past at alarming speed. Morrison kept the aircraft centered, fighting the tendency to swerve. Sarah monitored engine instruments, ready to adjust thrust if needed. Chen called out speeds as they decelerated. 50 knots, 130 knots, 100 knots. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the aircraft's headlong rush began to diminish. The end of the runway approached close, too close, but their speed continued to drop. Knots, 60 knots, 40 knots. When they finally rolled to a stop, they were 300 feet from the runway's end, close enough to see the grass beyond clearly. For a moment, no one moved. The sudden silence after the chaos felt surreal. Morrison was first to speak, his voice hoarse. "Good landing." Sarah let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Good landing." Then the emergency vehicles surrounded them, foam spraying across the aircraft, as firefighters ensured there would be no post-landing fire. In the cabin, passengers remained frozen for several heartbeats before reality crashed back in. They had survived. Against impossible odds, they had survived. The cabin erupted in cheers, tears, and applause. Strangers embraced. Parents clutched children and wept with relief. Maria Santos stood in the forward galley, tears streaming down her face as the weight of responsibility finally lifted. In the cockpit, Morrison initiated shutdown procedures while coordinating with ground control. Sarah remained in the first officer's seat, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The sleeping medication she had taken hours ago now reasserted itself, making her feel disconnected and slightly unreal. Chen reached forward and clasped her shoulder. "Thank you, Captain. I do not think we would have made it without you." Sarah managed a tired smile. "I just helped. You two did the heavy lifting." Morrison turned in his seat, extending his hand. "Captain Mitchell, I have been flying for 22 years. That was the finest piece of airmanship I've ever witnessed. Thank you for being on my aircraft today." Sarah shook his hand, feeling the weight of what they had accomplished settling over her. "Just doing what I was trained to do." The evacuation proceeded smoothly. Emergency slides deployed, and passengers descended to the tarmac, where buses waited to transport them to the terminal. Medical personnel triaged minor injuries, mostly bumps and bruises from the rough landing. Miraculously, no one had been seriously hurt. Sarah was among the last to deplane, her legs unsteady as she descended the stairs to the tarmac. Airport officials waited at the bottom, along with a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as a representative from the airline. "Captain Mitchell, on behalf of everyone at the airline, thank you. What you did today saved 347 lives." Sarah nodded wearily. "I was glad I could help. We will need to debrief with you, of course. The aviation authorities will want statements. And the media," he hesitated. "This is going to be a major story," Sarah groaned inwardly. The media attention was the last thing she wanted. She was a military officer who valued privacy and protocol. Being thrust into the public spotlight felt wrong. "Can that wait?" she asked. "I would really like to just find somewhere to sleep for about 12 hours. The airline representative nodded quickly. "Of course. We have arranged accommodations at a hotel near the airport. Tomorrow will be soon enough for all of that." As she was led toward a waiting vehicle, Sarah turned back to look at the 777 sitting on the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles. The aircraft looked peaceful now, almost serene in the late morning light. It was hard to believe that less than an hour ago it had been a wounded bird fighting for survival. Morrison and Chen appeared beside her, having completed their post-landing duties. "We are heading to the same hotel," Morrison said. "Buy you a drink later?" Sarah smiled. "Make it coffee and you have got a deal." The three pilots rode together in silence, each processing what they had experienced. The hotel was efficient and anonymous, exactly what they all needed. Sarah checked in, accepted her room key, and rode the elevator to the 4th floor in a daze. Her room was small but comfortable. She closed the door, leaned against it, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Her hands began to shake, delayed reaction to the stress and adrenaline. She moved to the bed and sat down heavily. Her phone had dozens of missed calls and messages, but she ignored them. Instead, she lay back on the bed, still fully clothed, and closed her eyes. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless, her body shutting down completely after the intense demands of the last 2 hours. When she woke, the room was dark. She checked her phone, 11 p.m. She had slept for nearly 13 hours. The messages on her phone had multiplied exponentially. Her commanding officer, her parents, friends, news organizations. The story had indeed gone global. She scrolled through news headlines. Hero pilot saves hundreds. Military training prevents disaster. Female fighter pilot lands crippled airliner. The narratives were already being written, the story simplified and dramatized for public consumption. A knock at her door pulled her from her phone. She opened it to find Morrison and Chen, both looking rested but concerned. "We saw your light on," Morrison explained. "Wanted to check that you were all right." Sarah managed a smile. "As all right as can be expected. Come in." They entered, and Morrison handed her a coffee from the hotel's late-night cafe. "Thought you might need this." She accepted it gratefully, sipping the hot liquid. "So I assume you have been dealing with the media circus?" Chen nodded. "The airline has us scheduled for a press conference tomorrow. They want all three of us there. The regulatory agencies are also investigating. Standard procedure for this kind of incident." Sarah set down her coffee. "I suppose I cannot avoid it. But I need to contact my commanding officer first. Get clearance for any public statements." Morrison sat in one of the room's chairs. The preliminary reports indicate the hydraulic failure was a catastrophic fracture in a main line. Impossible to predict or prevent. In other words, it was not pilot error or maintenance negligence. Just terrible luck and amazing skill that prevented tragedy, Chen added, looking at Sarah. "The aviation community is already analyzing what we did up there. The techniques you introduced, using differential thrust for control, the energy management approach. It is going to change how we train for similar emergencies." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I just applied what I know from fighter aircraft. Any military pilot would have done the same. But you were the one who was there, Morrison said quietly. That makes all the difference. They talked for another hour, processing the experience together, sharing observations and reactions. The bond forged in crisis remained strong, connecting three people who had been strangers 24 hours earlier. Eventually, Morrison and Chen departed, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts once more. She looked at her phone again, at the messages waiting. One in particular caught her attention, from Colonel David Harrison, her commanding officer. Mitchell, the message read, "Saw the news. Outstanding work. Take whatever time you need in Ireland, then report back for debrief." "Proud of you, Harrison," Sarah smiled. Her military family understood. They knew what she had done and why. That recognition meant more than any media attention could provide. She spent the next hour responding to messages from family and close friends, assuring them she was fine, downplaying her role. Her parents, particularly her father, a retired Air Force pilot himself, expressed pride mixed with concern. Her younger brother sent a text that made her laugh. "Always knew you were a show-off." "Seriously, though, well done." Finally, she pulled up the airline's statement about the incident. It was professional and factual, praising the crew's actions without excessive dramatization. Good. She appreciated their restraint. Her phone rang, an unknown Irish number. She hesitated, then answered. "Captain Mitchell?" A woman's voice, warm with an Irish accent. "My name is Claire O'Brien. I was a passenger on your flight, C-23A. I just wanted to call and say thank you. I have 2 daughters at home. Because of you, I will see them again." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I'm glad I could help." "You did more than help, dear. You saved our lives. I will never forget what you did. Never." The woman's voice broke. "Thank you." After the call ended, Sarah sat in silence, processing the emotional weight of that conversation. This was what it meant to save lives, not abstract numbers or statistics, but real people with families, dreams, futures. 347 individuals who would go home because 3 pilots refused to give up. The weight of that responsibility, the knowledge of what could have been lost, settled heavily on her shoulders. But alongside it came a profound sense of purpose. This was why she had chosen to serve, to use her skills and training to protect others. Today, that mission had succeeded in ways she never anticipated. Tomorrow would bring press conferences, investigations, and media attention. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had done her duty, lived up to her training, and made a difference when it mattered most. As she finally changed into sleeping clothes and prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had led her to that cockpit. If she had not taken that sleeping pill, she might have been awake, alert, and more hesitant to step forward. If she had been seated in a different part of the aircraft, she might not have reached the galley in time. If Morrison had been too proud to accept help, the outcome could have been tragically different. Hundreds of small choices and circumstances had aligned to place her in the right position at the right moment. Some might call it fate. Sarah preferred to think of it as readiness meeting opportunity. She had trained her entire career for situations that might never occur. Today, that preparation had been validated in the most dramatic way possible. She climbed into bed, exhausted but at peace. Outside, Shannon Airport continued its nighttime operations, aircraft arriving and departing in the normal rhythm of modern aviation. Tomorrow, Flight 2847 would be analyzed, discussed, and remembered. But tonight, it was just another aircraft on the ground, its passengers scattered across hotels and homes, grateful to be alive. Sarah drifted towards sleep, her mind already moving past the crisis to what came next. She would complete the required debriefings, handle the media obligations, and then return to her squadron. There were missions waiting, responsibilities that required her presence. Life would continue, as it always did, until the next moment when training and skill would be called upon. In the darkness of her hotel room, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself a small smile. She had been asleep in row 10, just another passenger on a routine flight. But when the captain asked for help, she had been ready. And that readiness had made all the difference. The press conference room at Shannon Airport buzzed with journalists from around the world. Cameras lined the back wall while reporters filled every available seat, notebooks ready, recorders positioned strategically on the table. Sarah sat between Morrison and Chen, uncomfortable in her military dress uniform. The airline's public relations team had coached them on messaging, but nothing could prepare her for the intensity of dozens of eyes fixed upon her. Waiting for the story they had already begun to write, Morrison spoke first, providing a technical overview of the hydraulic failure and the emergency procedures they had followed. His delivery was calm and professional, exactly what the situation required. When Sarah's turn came, she kept her statement brief. "I did what any military pilot would do in that situation. I applied my training to help the crew land safely. Captain Morrison and First Officer Chen are the real heroes here. They maintained control of the aircraft under impossible conditions." The questions came rapidly, overlapping, urgent. "Captain Mitchell, how did it feel to save 347 lives? Were you frightened during the landing? Will you continue flying commercial or return to military service? Do you think being a woman made this accomplishment more significant?" Sarah answered each question with measured patience, deflecting praise, emphasizing teamwork, refusing to be drawn into dramatic narratives. She watched the reporters' disappointment as she declined to provide the emotional sound bites they craved. One journalist persisted. "Captain, surely you must feel some sense of pride in what you accomplished." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "I feel grateful that I was in a position to help. Pride is not the right word. Relief, perhaps. Responsibility fulfilled. That is what military service teaches you. You do what needs to be done when it needs to be done." The press conference concluded after 45 minutes. Sarah escaped to a quiet corridor, loosening her collar and breathing deeply. Morrison found her there, offering a knowing smile. "You handled that well," he said. "Better than I expected, honestly. Most people would have enjoyed the spotlight." Sarah shook her head. "I'm a soldier, not a celebrity. This feels wrong somehow, like I am taking credit for just doing my job." "You saved hundreds of lives," Morrison reminded her gently. "People need to know that heroes exist, that ordinary moments can become extraordinary through skill and courage." "I was asleep in row 10, Sarah replied quietly. "Nothing heroic about that. But when the moment came, you were ready. That is what matters." 3 days later, Sarah returned to her Air Force base in Nevada. Her squadron greeted her with a mixture of pride and good-natured teasing. Her wingman presented her with a toy commercial airliner signed by the entire unit. "For when fighter jets get boring," the inscription read. Colonel Harrison called her into his office, his expression serious but warm. "Sit down, Mitchell." She obeyed, suddenly nervous despite her recent accomplishments. "The Pentagon is pleased," Harrison began. "Your actions reflected well on the Air Force and demonstrated the value of our training. However," he paused, "there are concerns about the media attention. Some feel it could compromise your effectiveness in combat operations." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "Am I being grounded?" Harrison smiled. "On the contrary, you are being promoted. The Senate fast-tracked your approval for Major. Congratulations." Relief and surprise flooded through her. "Thank you, sir." But Harrison was not finished. "There is more. The Air Force wants you to help develop new training protocols for commercial aviation emergencies. Share your expertise with civilian pilots. It would mean temporary reassignment, possibly 6 months of consulting work." Sarah considered the proposal. It meant leaving her squadron, stepping away from combat operations. But it also meant her knowledge could prevent future disasters, save more lives. "I will do it," she said finally. "If it helps others, I will do it." 6 months became a year. Sarah found unexpected satisfaction in teaching, in translating combat flying techniques for commercial application. She worked with airlines, regulators, and training facilities, developing programs that emphasized adaptability, energy management, and crisis decision-making. The story of Flight 2847 became a case study in aviation schools worldwide. But for Sarah, it remained something more personal, a reminder that readiness and skill could intersect with need at any moment. She stayed in contact with Morrison and Chen. They met annually on the anniversary of the landing. 3 pilots bound by shared experience. The passengers formed an association, staying connected, celebrating their second chance at life. On the second anniversary, Sarah received a package. Inside was a framed photograph of the 777 on the runway at Shannon, surrounded by emergency vehicles. Attached was a note signed by all 347 passengers. "Thank you for being awake when we needed you most." Sarah hung the photograph in her office, a reminder of the day ordinary preparation met extraordinary need. She had been asleep in row 10, just another passenger on a routine flight. But when the captain asked if there were any combat pilots on board, she'd been ready to answer. And in that moment, everything she had trained for, every hour in the cockpit, every simulation, every lesson learned, had converged into purpose. She had not saved lives because she was exceptional. She had saved lives because she was prepared. Years later, now a full colonel and instructor at the Air Force's weapons school, Sarah would tell her students the story, not as a tale of heroism, but as a lesson in readiness. "You never know when your skills will be called upon," she would say. "You never know when ordinary will become extraordinary. Train like lives depend on it, because someday they might." The students would listen, inspired by the quiet intensity of a woman who had been tested in the most public way possible and had not been found wanting. Sarah Mitchell had been asleep in row 10, but when duty called, she had been awake, alert and ready. And that readiness had made all the difference between tragedy and triumph, between loss and life, between what could have been and what was. In the end, that is what service means. Being ready for the moment you cannot predict, in the place you do not expect, doing the thing that only you can do. Sarah had been that person in that moment, in that place, and 347 people would forever be grateful that she was.